The proliferation of harmful contents on social media has been a major point of concern for advertisers around the world. In July this year, more than 1,000 brands boycotted Facebook, YouTube and Twitter for their poor handling of hateful content. That move led to the big social media companies and the World Federation of Advertisers striking a deal to allow external audits and implement common standards to deal with harmful content. Back home, we've seen two major brands, Bajaj Auto and Parle, go public with their decision to stop advertising on channels which, according to them, carry toxic content. To add to the woes of both advertisers and broadcasters, there are allegations of TRP fixing linked to 3 channels, a matter that's currently under investigation. In the midst of all of these developments, I speak to veteran ad man and long-time India observer, Martin Sorrell, the CEO of S4 Capital. Martin Sorrell, always a pleasure. Many thanks for joining us here on CNBC-TV18. Let me start by asking you what you make of this trend where we see brands wanting to take a stand, taking a position. You can call it ethical advertising or whatever else you like, but it is certainly more visible today globally post the Black Lives Matter movement. Brands are actively coming out and taking a position on an issue that may not necessarily be linked to their line of business. So this attitude that we're not just concerned about shareholder profit, but equally alive to issues related to society at large, to race, gender, environment. What do you make of this trend, Martin Sorrell?
I think it's to be welcomed. I think anything that looks at the long term. I mean, you talked about stakeholder capitalism or the stakeholders that surround an enterprise. I think more important than that, I think probably we over-intellectualize that, if I can be so bold. I think what we basically do is think about the long term. And when you start to think about life that way, or that the purpose of the company is to maximize long-term profitability, not short-term profitability, everything falls into place. So issues about the sort of things that you're talking about, taking a position on social issues or ethical issues or moral issues, make sense, but be careful what you wish for, because we all deal in very varied communities. Those communities have access, open access now, to social media. They had access to newspapers and televisions and radio and magazines before, but the nature of the technology is so pervasive now that the power of these social platforms is very considerable. So these positions have to be thought through, and you probably have to be prepared to take some flack from parts of the community that may not necessarily agree with the position you're taking. I mean, a position you might take on an issue might have been okay, might have not been okay a few years ago, but now or in the future could be okay, but you may be in advance of events. So you have to be prepared for the downside as well as the upside. But overall, taking a position is to be welcomed. And I think brands, consumers, and people, all stakeholders, whether it's people who work in a company, the people that interact with the company, government, all forms of stakeholders, pressure groups, all welcome in one way or another companies and brands and operations taking a stand. So I think on balance to be welcomed, but there are pitfalls.
You're saying that taking a position is something to be welcomed, but let's address those pitfalls that you speak of. You talked about the downside and the upside. You talked about how companies could sometimes face flack and pushback from a community. How should the advertiser or brand negotiate that? Because it is a delicate balance. We've had instances in the past where positive social messaging on the part of an advertising campaign has been called out for being inauthentic or being opportunistic. In India, we've just had a recent issue with an advertisement, the Tanishq ad. I don't know if you watched it or not. The company decided to withdraw the ad, even though it doesn't violate any advertising guidelines. So what is the balance that brands and advertisers will need to strike?
Well, the key is, I think you put your finger on it, the key is whether it's authentic or not. If it's forced or unnatural or not in line with the brand or the company or the service that we're talking about, it often fails. We often call this virtue signaling. We saw a fair bit of that around COVID, actually, that we saw a number of companies and you looked at the advertising and you couldn't distinguish one company or service or product from another. It was virtue signaling. It was very general, generic stuff, which may have served a purpose in a CMO's minds, but certainly consumers found somewhat inappropriate or maybe even offensive because it wasn't authentic. So virtue signaling, or the concerns around what is called virtue signaling, that is being virtuous for the sake of it, not because you authentically or really believe in it, is a pitfall. Now, how do you avoid it? Well, you obviously have the tried and tested techniques of research and testing, but even those techniques are often unable to unearth reactions. So you have to be careful. You have to be thoughtful. Particularly if you are taking a position in advance of an issue, and it might be an ethnic issue, a racial issue, a religious issue, as you're referring to in the case of India recently. But there are many, many examples. I mean, another example of it in social media was the suppression by the social media, by the platforms, a New York Post article in relation to the Biden campaign and the presidential nominee's son and events surrounding that. So it's a very difficult area to navigate, and it has great upsides, but it also has great risks and pitfalls.
Yes, you're right in pointing out those risks, but you talked about the rise of social media, Martin Sorrell. In your experience of what you've seen over the last few years, the rise of social media platforms, they've acquired reach, gone deeper, got a significant amount of penetration across different geographies, across different constituencies and target groups. Is social media now starting to shape advertising and marketing?
Well, it's an extremely important one. If you look at the worldwide spend on media, it's about 500 billion, 550 billion, really excluding much of what goes on in China. But if you're of that 500 to 550, about 250 billion this year will be on digital media, of which the platforms, whether you call them social media platforms or not, but Google might account for about 165 billion of that. Facebook about 65 billion, Amazon maybe 15 to 20. So that's the bulk in those three platforms of all digital media. And so these platforms, and there are 6 basically, there are the 3 Western ones that I've mentioned, and the 3 Eastern ones, Chinese ones, around Alibaba, Tencent, and controversially, obviously, TikTok. I mean, I think TikTok in India is the second largest country for TikTok beyond China. So given recent developments around TikTok, or lack of developments, obviously what happens to TikTok in India is going to be pretty crucial to TikTok's future outside China. So these platforms are really important. And of course, their scale, Facebook has not reached $1 trillion of market cap, but Amazon and Google have, and Apple has as well, and Microsoft. So these platforms and software companies are becoming phenomenally powerful, and with power comes responsibility. And we've already seen the platforms adjust to this. I mean, Facebook, for example, came under heavy criticism, even a boycott. I don't think the boycott was particularly successful. It did draw attention to the issue. I think the best way of dealing with issues such as the boycott tried to identify is to go and talk to the people who run Facebook, whether it be Mark Zuckerberg or Sheryl Sandberg or Carolyn Everson or whoever it is, and lay out the concerns privately. I think it's a bit like dealing, people say best way to deal with the Chinese is not to try and humiliate them in public, but talk to them privately and make your point of view known. And I think that's probably the best way. And we've seen changes in the way that Facebook manage their platform.
You spoke about how tech companies might have reacted to the boycott Facebook campaign, though it didn't really dent their advertising revenue much. But do you believe that this lever that advertisers like Unilever, etc., have used, this temporary boycott of social media platforms, is something that we will probably start to see much more of? And if we do, what is going to be the long-term implication of this?
Well, inevitably people will, I suppose, try it. I don't know whether it certainly creates noise. You said it had no impact. I think it might have had some impact in switching spending, for example, from advertising spending from Facebook to Instagram. But often people don't realize that Facebook and Instagram are owned by the same company. So it's robbing Peter to pay Paul, so to speak. But look, I think the inevitable consequence of this, you will see more activity of that nature, even if it's ineffective. But I think what should happen is advertisers like the one that you raised. You raised the example of Unilever, which obviously in an Indian context, indeed in a global context, is really important. I think companies like Unilever will continue to put their points of view in relation to their own brands and in relation to society as a whole, because Unilever is such an important company, not only in the context of India, but globally. And purpose, whether it be Paul Polman as CEO or Alan Jope as CEO, purpose has been fundamental to everything that Unilever does and stands for. So I think inevitably you're going to see more of attention. Whether it's most effective to do it through boycotts or not is another question. I don't happen to think it is. I think the best way is for the key people at the client and the key people at their agency, if they have one, is to not duck the issue, but be very forthright with the platforms about what they're doing. I think the other thing you have to look at the reverse side from it, and the platforms do a lot of good in relation to small business. I mentioned Geo. Geo is a platform, in my mind, for the small business and entrepreneur in India, just like Jack Ma talks about Alibaba as being the sort of engine room of entrepreneurs. You have to be very careful what you wish for with these platforms. During COVID, many small businesses and medium-sized businesses, which are the engine of the economy in terms of employment and politically are really important, particularly in the context of a country like India. These platforms give small and medium-sized businesses access to advertising in a way they never had before. Generally, television advertising, and indeed some areas of the press and magazines, are more expensive. And online advertising can be a much more effective, more measurable, and cheaper way for smaller and medium-sized businesses to reach their customers. So when the regulator steps in, be careful what you wish for, because you may be killing the golden goose in a little bit, in a way, particularly for the small and medium-sized businesses that can't afford expensive television advertising.
So be careful of over-regulation. But, one of the other things that we've seen happen is brands choosing to course correct. You were talking about Unilever and Unilever's, purpose-driven strategy through its history. So let's use that as the example with what they're trying to do with Fair and Lovely. With dropping the word fair from the brand name, removing that as a key attribute. We're seeing this happen globally with a lot of other companies taking the same position. Do you see this kind of course correction that brands are now doing, that something that we're going to see much more of?
Well, you are, but the Unilever example you quote is a good example of the senior management of Unilever under Paul Polman and now under Alan Jope have taken a very strong position on purpose, and I think Alan has said at the beginning of his CEO-ship, the beginning of his reign, that all of his brands should have purpose at their core, and I think we all applaud that. But there are some hard choices that have to be made, and if one of your brands or one of your services offends that purpose, or is not authentic, or pays lip service to that objective, you have to make some hard commercial decisions, which may actually cost you short-term profitability. That's what I think is the fundamental. This is where I think the debate gets a little bit too complicated. I think it's very simple. I think we're in business for the long term. We're building S4 capital for the long term. We're not Johnny-come-latelys who are focused on the short term. We don't want to hit and run or cut and run or boost profitability in the short term. We're interested. That's why, for example, during COVID, it's a very good example. We added 22% to the number of people working in the company, whereas in India, the agencies are decimating their headcounts. Worldwide, the agencies, including WPP, are jettisoning about 50,000 people, according to Forrester, and in America alone. Independent agencies and the holdcos, the ad holdcos as they're called, are getting rid of 50,000 people, again, according to the pundits. That's not something. We think the purpose of S4, just localizing it to ourselves for a minute, is to create employment opportunities for our people, particularly at a time when that's difficult in the short term because of COVID. And secondly, in the long term, technology may deny people job opportunities, and what you have to do is generate them. So that's part of our social purpose. So it goes beyond that to climate change and diversity and equity and inclusion. And we're being very aggressive in that area. 40% of our people in the US and the UK, where we have reliable statistics as yet, although we'll have them fully for the whole of the world, 40% of people of color. So we are trying to implement these virtuous policies in a genuine way across a number of areas, but jobs and generating jobs can become even more important. But it involves hard decisions, and the Unilever example that you quote, it's a very difficult one because at the margin, you're going to have to make some decisions that may well cost you short-term profitability if you really believe in the long-term importance of those purpose objectives.
Well, yes, those are choices that each brand will have to make. Martin Sorrell, we will take a break, but on the other side, we discuss the TRP controversy in India and its implications for advertisers. Stay tuned. We'll be right back on the CNBC-TV18 Conversations.